Ricky Ray Rector was a man trapped in a child's mind. After committing 2 murders, a failed suicide attempt left him severely brain damaged. Unable to comprehend his execution, he spent his final day like a toddler, talking about food, asking simple questions, and showing no fear of death. Detached from reality, he faced his fate with an unsettling innocence, unaware of what was about to happen. The early life. Ricky Ray Rector was born on January 12, 1950, in Conway, Arkansas. He grew up in a small town where life was tough for most families, especially for those with limited income like his. Ricky was the third of 5 children in a household that struggled to make ends meet. His parents worked hard, but there was never enough to go around. Money was tight, and opportunities to break free from the cycle of poverty were even tighter. Ricky's family was close-knit, but their struggles often caused tension at home. The kids learned early on how to stretch every dollar and make do with what they had. Despite the hardships, neighbors and those who knew him as a child often remembered Ricky as a quiet boy. He didn't stand out much, blending into the background of the tight-knit community. But beneath the surface, his life was anything but simple. From an early age, Ricky had trouble in school. He wasn't disruptive or a troublemaker, but he had difficulty keeping up with his classmates. Reading and math were especially hard for him, and teachers noticed he seemed to zone out during lessons. While other kids played sports or joined clubs, Ricky often stayed on the sidelines. It wasn't because he didn't want to join in, it was more like he didn't know how to. By the time he was a teenager, Ricky's struggles in school began to take a toll. He started skipping classes and falling further behind. Teachers described him as polite but distant, someone who just couldn't seem to find his place. Friends came and went, and Ricky's confidence shrank with each passing year. He felt like the world was moving forward while he was stuck in one place. As Ricky entered his 20s, life didn't get much easier. He worked odd jobs to help support himself, but he never stayed in one place for very long. Construction work, manual labor, and other physically demanding jobs were the only options available to someone without an education or specialized skills. Ricky wasn't lazy, but his frustration with life's hardships grew over time. By his late 20s, Ricky's behavior began to change. Small incidents like losing his temper at work or getting into minor disagreements with friends became more frequent. One coworker recalled an argument that escalated so quickly it shocked everyone around. These moments didn't happen every day, but they hinted at deeper struggles Ricky was facing. He seemed stuck in a cycle of frustration and helplessness, unable to see a way out. Family and friends noticed that he was becoming more withdrawn, spending long hours alone and avoiding conversations about his future. Looking back, it's clear these were warning signs of the turmoil that would later define his life. The crimes. In early 1981, Ricky Ray Rector's life took a significant turn. At 31 years old, Rector was struggling with a sense of dissatisfaction and frustration. On the evening of March 21, 1981, these emotions came to a head. Rector had planned to attend a party at a local establishment, but things didn't go as expected. He was denied entry to the private gathering, which angered him. Instead of leaving, he lingered near the area, stewing over the perceived slight. The rejection seemed to ignite a deeper frustration within him, leading to decisions that would forever alter his life and the lives of others. The next evening, March 22, 1981, Rector entered Tommy's old-fashioned home-style restaurant in Conway, Arkansas. The restaurant was a familiar place in the community, and many people were there that night, including Rector's acquaintance, Arthur Criswell. Criswell was a friend of Rector's, but that night their interaction turned deadly. Rector, still upset from the previous evening, approached Criswell. Witnesses later recounted that there didn't seem to be any major argument or conflict between the two. Without warning, Rector pulled out a gun and shot Criswell, killing him instantly. The sudden act of violence shocked everyone present. In the chaos, 2 bystanders were also injured as Rector fired his weapon. The reasons for Rector's actions remain unclear, but his anger and frustration from the night before may have played a role. After the shooting, Rector fled the scene, leaving behind a community in shock and mourning. Police quickly identified him as the suspect, and a manhunt began. For 2 days, authorities searched for Rector, gathering evidence and questioning those who knew him. On March 24, 1981, police tracked Rector to his mother's home, where he was believed to be hiding. Officer Robert Martin, a well-respected member of the Conway Police Department with nearly 2 decades of service, was part of the team sent to apprehend Rector. Officer Martin approached the house, hoping to resolve the situation peacefully. However, as Martin engaged with Rector's family, Rector emerged with a firearm. Without hesitation, he shot Officer Martin, fatally wounding him. Martin died at the scene, becoming the second person Rector had killed in the span of just 2 days. The murder of a police officer heightened the urgency of the search for Rector and escalated the severity of his crimes. After shooting Officer Martin, Rector turned the gun on himself in what appeared to be a suicide attempt. He fired a shot into his own head, intending to end his life. However, the bullet did not kill him. Instead, it caused significant damage to his brain, leaving him severely impaired. Rector was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked to save his life. During the procedure, doctors removed a large portion of his frontal lobe, which had been destroyed by the gunshot. Although the surgery saved him, it left him with permanent brain damage. His cognitive abilities were greatly reduced, and he could no longer process complex thoughts or understand the consequences of his actions. This marked a turning point in Rector's story, as his mental state became a central issue in the legal battles that followed. Following his recovery, Rector was taken into custody and charged with multiple crimes, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case attracted significant attention due to the nature of the crimes and Rector's mental condition. His brain injury and its effects became a central focus of his trial, raising questions about his competence to stand trial and the ethical implications of pursuing the death penalty in his case. The trial. After his recovery from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, Ray Rector was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Rector was transferred to a secure facility, where his mental condition became a major factor in the case. His trial would raise questions about justice, fairness, and the treatment of individuals with severe mental impairments. Before the trial began, the court faced a critical question. Was Rector mentally fit to stand trial? His self-inflicted gunshot wound had caused severe brain damage, leaving him with significant cognitive impairments. Experts on both sides provided conflicting testimony. Some argued that Rector could not understand the proceedings or the consequences of his actions. Others claimed that despite his impairments, he was capable of participating in his defense. Judge George F. Hara ultimately ruled that Rector was competent to stand trial. The decision was based on the evidence presented, including evaluations by psychologists and psychiatrists. This ruling allowed the case to proceed, but it sparked a debate about whether justice could be served in such circumstances. The trial of Ray Rector began in 1982. It took place in a highly charged atmosphere, with strong emotions on both sides. The prosecution focused on the severity of Rector's crimes, emphasizing the killing of Officer Robert Martin, a respected member of the Conway Police Department. The defense, on the other hand, centered its arguments on Rector's mental condition. During the trial, the jury heard evidence about the events leading up to the murders. Witnesses recounted Rector's actions at Tommy's old-fashioned home-style restaurant, where he killed Arthur Criswell and injured 2 others. The prosecution also presented testimony about the fatal shooting of Officer Martin, highlighting the impact of Rector's actions on the community and the Martin family. The defense focused on Rector's cognitive impairments, calling on medical experts to explain the extent of his brain damage. They described how the gunshot wound had removed a significant portion of his frontal lobe, leaving him unable to process complex thoughts or plan his actions. Psychologists testified that Rector struggled to understand the trial process, often failing to grasp the significance of key moments. They argued that executing someone in Rector's condition would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. After deliberation, the jury found Ray Rector guilty of both counts of first-degree murder. The conviction was based on the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution, including eyewitness accounts and forensic findings. Despite the defense's arguments about Rector's mental state, the jury concluded that he was responsible for his actions. The court sentenced Rector to death for the murder of Officer Martin. The decision reflected the jury's belief that the severity of the crime warranted the maximum penalty. However, the sentence further fueled debates about the ethics of executing someone with severe cognitive impairments. Following his conviction, Rector's legal team pursued appeals in an effort to overturn the death sentence. They argued that the trial had failed to account for the full extent of Rector's impairments. Appeals focused on claims that Rector's execution would violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. The appeals process brought additional scrutiny to the case. Legal experts debated the standards for determining competency in capital cases, highlighting the challenges of balancing justice and compassion. Despite these efforts, the courts upheld Rector's conviction and death sentence, allowing the case to move forward. On death row, Rector spent much of his time in isolation. His interactions with other inmates and staff were limited, though he was noted for being generally cooperative. His routine was similar to that of other inmates on death row, consisting of meals, limited exercise, and time in his cell. However, his mental condition set him apart. Rector's cognitive impairments made it difficult for him to follow the structure of prison life. He required reminders for basic tasks and often appeared unaware of the passing of time. Despite this, he did not exhibit aggressive behavior and was generally regarded as a low-maintenance inmate by prison staff. The final 24 hours. On January 24, 1992, Ray Rector woke up in the Cummins unit in Arkansas, marking the beginning of his last day. His execution was scheduled for later that evening, and while the atmosphere in the prison grew tense, Rector followed his usual routine with no clear understanding of what lay ahead. At approximately 3 a.m., prison staff delivered his breakfast. The tray contained eggs, a hot dog, biscuits, and gravy. Rector ate only the hot dog before returning to sleep. His behavior reflected detachment rather than anxiety, likely a result of his cognitive impairments. Rector's brain injury caused severe mental impairments, limiting his understanding of abstract concepts like the future or the permanence of death. Throughout the day, his actions alternated between moments of childlike detachment and flashes of awareness, but his routine remained mostly undisturbed. According to some of the guards on duty that time, as dawn broke, Rector stirred in his cell and turned on the television. A local news broadcast discussing his execution caught his attention. For a brief moment, he seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the day, muttering softly about being in trouble. However, his reaction quickly shifted, and he began clapping his hands, dancing, and shouting nonsensical phrases. These moments of seemingly celebratory behavior underscored his inability to fully grasp the seriousness of his situation. Later in the morning, a guard woke Rector and asked if he needed anything. Rector requested a shower, which he took before returning to his cell with fresh linens. Afterward, he fell into a deep sleep, snoring loudly. When he awoke, his demeanor was calm, even casual. Speaking to the guard, he made matter-of-fact remarks about his execution, expressing neither fear nor resistance. At 10:44 a.m., Rector received what was described as his second-to-last meal. The tray included 2 pork chops, sweet potatoes, collard greens, 2 cups of Jell-O, and milk. He ate everything quickly, leaving nothing behind. His enthusiasm for the meal stood in contrast to the growing tension in the prison, highlighting his detachment from the reality of his impending execution. After eating, Rector announced that he intended to nap again. However, just a few minutes later, he was awake, stretching and pacing in his cell. As the day progressed, his movements became increasingly erratic. He began snapping his fingers, stomping his feet, and pacing back and forth. At one point, he barked like a dog, his actions seemingly disconnected from the solemnity of the situation. Later, he cried out loudly, calling for his mother in a haunting outburst that left a deep impression on those nearby. While Rector went about his day in the prison, his attorneys worked tirelessly outside to secure a last-minute reprieve. George Rosen, one of Rector's lawyers, spent the morning making frantic calls to Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Rosen argued that Rector's mental impairments made the execution ethically and legally questionable, emphasizing that his client did not fully comprehend the consequences of his actions or the significance of his execution. Despite Rosen's efforts, his pleas went unanswered. Governor Clinton, facing the pressures of a presidential campaign, had little political incentive to intervene. Clinton's tough-on-crime stance was a cornerstone of his campaign strategy, and overseeing Rector's execution became a key part of maintaining that image. By the afternoon, it was clear that no legal or political reprieve would come. Rector's fate was sealed. At noon, Chaplain Charles Pigman visited Rector in the prison's visitation center. They sat together at a small table, with Rector shackled in leg irons. During their conversation, Rector asked if they could sing together. Pigman agreed, and the two sang hymns, including Amazing Grace and a Sunday school song that Rector remembered from his childhood. The chaplain later described the moment as deeply emotional, as Rector seemed genuinely comforted by the music. Later in the afternoon, Reverend Colin Morton also visited Rector. During their conversation, Rector repeatedly asked about childhood friends who had passed away years earlier. Despite being told that they were no longer alive, he continued to inquire about them, even expressing a desire for some of them to serve as pallbearers at his funeral. Morton noted that these remarks reflected Rector's limited understanding of time and mortality. After praying together, Morton departed, leaving Rector alone once more. Throughout the day, Rector showed particular enthusiasm for his last meal. He repeatedly asked the guards about the timing of the meal, speaking with excitement about the steak and chicken he had requested. By the afternoon, his childlike anticipation for the meal became one of the few constants in his behavior. His comments about the food stood in stark contrast to the solemnity of the day, further emphasizing his inability to fully comprehend the events unfolding around him. At 2:57 p.m., Rector's final meal arrived. The tray included steak cooked well done, fried chicken smothered in gravy, brown beans, cherry Kool-Aid, and a slice of pecan pie. Rector greeted the meal with visible enthusiasm, snapping his fingers and smiling as he began eating. He took his time, savoring the meal, but left the pecan pie untouched. When asked why, he replied that he was saving it for later, a statement that highlighted his belief that he would return to his cell after the execution. As evening approached, Rector was moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber. He continued to interact with the guards in a calm and cooperative manner, showing no signs of resistance or fear. His demeanor reflected his limited understanding of the finality of his situation. At approximately 9 p.m., 7 guards in riot gear arrived at Rector's cell. They flanked him as he was escorted down a narrow corridor to the execution chamber. Witnesses, including Reverend Morton, Attorney George Rosen, and law enforcement officials, gathered in the viewing room to observe the execution. The room was quiet, filled with tension, as everyone prepared for the final moments. Once Rector was strapped to the gurney, the medical team encountered difficulties locating a suitable vein for the lethal injection. The muffled sounds of their struggle could be heard in the viewing room, where witnesses waited uneasily. The delay stretched from minutes to nearly an hour, creating a tense and uncomfortable atmosphere. The medical team, initially consisting of 2 technicians, expanded to 5 as additional staff were called in to assist. Midnight loomed as a critical deadline. If the execution did not proceed by then, it would have to be postponed. Eventually, the medical team succeeded in finding a vein, and the process resumed. Rector, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, was given the opportunity to speak his final words. His remarks referenced his faith and baptism before the lethal injection began. The execution involved the administration of 3 drugs: sodium pentothal to induce unconsciousness, Pavilon to paralyze the lungs, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. As the drugs entered his system, Rector's eyes closed and his breathing slowed. The green line on the heart monitor began to waver as his body grew still. Witnesses leaned forward, watching intently as the monitor flatlined. At 10:09 p.m., Ricky Ray Rector was pronounced dead. The execution of Ricky Ray Rector remains one of the most debated cases in the history of capital punishment. His severe cognitive impairments raise significant ethical questions about the justice of executing individuals with such conditions. For some, Rector's execution represented justice for the victims of his crimes. For others, it highlighted the flaws in a system that failed to adequately address the complexities of mental health and criminal responsibility. Governor Clinton's role in the execution added a layer of political significance to the event. Critics argued that Clinton's decision to allow the execution to proceed was driven by his presidential ambitions, while supporters viewed it as a demonstration of his commitment to upholding the law.